Territory, and thank you so much for the warm welcome. And to you, George, for your wonderful words, and to the Chief. We are all here for one reason, and that is to find the country that we're named after. You see, Canada is a First Nations word, and it means village. It's one of the gifts that all of us celebrate. And yet the reality is, for too many, is that there are two villages. There's a village for those who are over in Parliament, and there's the village of those who never ceded the land. There are many definitions of reconciliation, but mine is not saying sorry twice. What the government is doing now is the most important thing. It isn't what happened when your grandparents were here or when your great-grandparents are here. It is what is happening on your watch. As Canadians and people who live in this country who believe in equality, who believe in freedom, who believe in democracy, who believe in fairness, it is your moment to stand on guard for your nation, for your values, and for your children. Not long ago, Prime Minister Harper apologized to First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples for the wrongs that were done to them during residential schools. Now, many of you know that for well over 100 years, Indian agents with the RCMP, if necessary, would arrive in communities and would take all 5-year-old children. They were taking them to schools where often the children were abused and where many of them died. There are over 100 graveyards on residential schools in this country. And as P.H. Bryce, one of my greatest heroes, said in 1904, medical science knows just what to do to stop them from dying. And the Canadian government not only didn't listen to Bryce, they actually fired him from his post as Chief Medical Health Officer. Now, the Prime Minister says, we now recognize that in separating children from their families, we undermine the ability of many to adequately parent their own children, and sow the seeds for generations to follow, and we apologize for having done this. There was a lot to apologize for. And many generations of those children weren't there to hear those words. But thankfully some were, and they were meaningful. But an elder who I hold dear in my life told me that when you make a mistake, your first duty is not to apologize. It's to learn what you have done wrong, to understand what you have done wrong so you don't do it again. It's what we teach our children. And that's why reconciliation, not meaning sorry twice, is so important to me. Now, I look like I'm alone up here on this stage, but there actually are many people with me. And I'm going to introduce you to 4 of my heroes tonight and tell their stories so that you can become inspired about the young people like Jessica who are making a difference. They are not just heroes for First Nations people. They are heroes for all humanity in all time. Well, one thing that many Canadians find hard to understand is that First Nations children get less government services than every other child in the country. Now, less goes against what we all think. We think that First Nations children get the same, if not more. There's all these Aboriginal programs out there after all. But those who live on reserve know it not to be true, and Sheila Fraser, the Auditor General, knows it not to be true, and the Government of Canada knows it not to be true. So how does this inequality happen? Well, provincial child welfare education laws, they apply both on and off reserve. But the provinces and territories expect the federal government to pick up the tab, and if the federal government does not do so, then the funding inequity continues for these children. They don't top it up. They just get less. And this isn't an issue of being in remote. I worked at the Squamish First Nation in British Columbia, which is right in North Vancouver. Those kids got less simply because of who they are. Who they are. Now, what does it mean? We've had tons of reports and tons of solutions that the government is well aware of. And we all know they have the resources. I mean, just yesterday in the Globe and Mail, they spent $130 million on those beautiful economic action signs that have made a difference in my life and yours, I'm sure. So they've had the resources, but they're not doing it. They're not doing it because I think they believe that we all don't care. That we're more concerned about the issues that they debate in the House of Parliament than we are about the children who are going to build our nations. And we need to let them know that they're wrong. And we also need to remind them that every day there's an inequality. There's a child out there living it. There's a child out there living it. This is one of my heroes. His name is Jordan River Anderson from Norway House Cree Nation. He was born in 1999, and he has about 8 brothers and sisters, and he's the youngest. Now, Ernest and Virginia had struggles in their own lives, and they were previously struggling with addictions as a way of dulling that pain, but they had for 11 years before Jordan was born conquered those addictions, and were loving, caring parents to this boy. It was a high-risk pregnancy, so Virginia Anderson traveled the 500 kilometers down to Winnipeg to give birth to Jordan, and he had to stay in hospital for the first 2 years of his life. So Dad goes back up to parent the rest of the kids, and the kids and the community members, they fundraise so everything is ready for Jordan on the day he is discharged. If he was a non-Aboriginal child, he would have gone home and the province of Manitoba would have picked up the bill. But he was a First Nations child, so the province of Manitoba expected the federal government to pick up the cost. And while I don't need to tell you all here living in Ottawa that there are about 160,000 federal bureaucrats passing the buck, can you imagine if this was your baby and that governments had to decide who would pay so that they could go home? Well, the government bureaucrats, they decided that the best thing is they didn't want to pick up a provincial cost if they were a federal bureaucrat, and God forbid if they were a provincial bureaucrat, they did not want to set a precedent of picking up a federal cost, so they were going to leave this little guy in the hospital while they argued over each individual item of his care. One of my friends is a woman by the name of Trudy LaValle, who then worked with the Assembly of Manitoba Chiefs, and she sat at one of those meetings. And they argued for over an hour about who would pay for a shower head. Can you imagine how many of your tax dollars were spent on their wages while they decided who would pay for that? This was at a time when our country was running a $22 billion surplus budget, but they didn't want to pick up the cost of a child living at home. And so what was it like for Jordan? While they were having those meetings, he was in the hospital. And like other little boys, he shared a room with other children. And these little boys would get better, and they would go home. And they would tell him about what it's like to be home. What it's like to have mud all the way up on your body after having splashed through the mud puddles. What it's like to feel grass beneath your feet. What it's like to roll a snowball. What it's like to smell bread baking in an oven.